when I was a theist, and I used to be, I was extremely religious. I grew up kind of in this bland world between my mother and my father, my mother was a true believer, and my dad was a bit of a skeptic. So I got a lot of this going on, but it was bland in the sense that there was never anything to hold on to until I got into my teens, and I had some what Mormons like to call spiritual experiences, which are basically just coincidences that you read into and say, oh, this must be God talking to me, and he wants me to do this, and he wants me to do that. So I got really, really religious, and went on a tear, and started studying like crazy, read all my stuff and everything. Now, one of the reasons that I believed in God at that time was because I thought that was the position where the arguments fell. You can argue this, and it makes sense to me that there would be a God. At the time, I was working for a Jewish theologian, helping him produce his stuff. I got very ecumenical. I was involved with a lot of different religions at the time, which is not very Mormon, by the way. That's a very they don't mix well with others. The theologian had encouraged me to write a book about God. Now, he had taught me, he was kind of tutoring me. He's a well-known radio talk show host now, and still very big in the Jewish community. And he had taught me this principle that you always have to know the other side. And so he encouraged me to write this book on my thoughts about some of these issues. It was slightly from a Mormon perspective and all of that kind of thing. And I started writing this, and I said to myself, I'm not doing what he told me to do, because I don't really know the other side of this argument. I know our arguments, and they sound great, and I'm pretty confident in everything, so I'm going to go look at the other side. I went down to the library and I checked out a book called The Atheist Debater's Handbook. If you can get your hands on it, it's very hard to find. It's absolutely spectacular, because all it does is basically go through the arguments and shows you why, whatever the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument, why these aren't necessarily slam dunks. I read through this thing and went into a bit of a panic, because the last thing I wanted to be in the world was an atheist. I didn't have the clothes for it, I didn't have shag carpet, none of that stuff. It was the early 90s. And I freaked out. I absolutely freaked out. And I called this guy, and I said, you got to help me out here. I've been doing what you said. I've been doing my research here, and I checked out this book, and I'm reading the arguments, and they're pretty powerful the other way. And I don't have anything. And I know you have to have been through this, so can we get together? He said, sure. We got together. We played racquetball, and on the drive back to the house, he said, all right, so hit me with some of this stuff. And I started hitting him with it. And, when you get into any field, there's stuff that you know. If you're a graphic designer, for instance, you know what the healing brush does in Photoshop. Or if you're a filmmaker like myself, you know what an f-stop is on a camera. Well, he didn't have a grasp on any of the nomenclature of this debate, and it hit me as we were driving home. He hasn't looked at the other side either, and my heart sunk, and I was just emotionally devastated, really, because when you're in a religion like Mormonism, for instance, Mormonism is a totalitarian religion. I don't say that in a negative sense even. All I'm saying is that it totally takes over your life. I mean, if you know Mormons, they're always doing Mormon stuff. Their life revolves around their Mormonism. It's a very cultural religion, very much like Judaism in that regard. They've kind of taken pieces of that and pieced it together. Your whole world revolves around it. Your whole sense of meaning, your whole sense of purpose, what you do on the days of the week is generally in some way touched by the church. And all of a sudden I felt like I was losing everything. It was pretty devastating. But one of the things that I learned as I started looking into that is, and this is an important thing, and it doesn't get said enough, we have these debates with people like William Lane Craig. Atheists will go out and debate William Lane Craig, which to me is ridiculous, because the entire notion of a debate on the subject of the existence of God is fraught with one big fallacy, and that is the idea that arguments are evidence. Carl Sagan said that that extraordinary claims should have extraordinary evidence or extraordinary proof. There is no more extraordinary claim than the fact that there is a personal being somewhere who is responsible for creating everything. That demands some pretty serious evidence in favor of it. And generally what you have is arguments. You don't have evidence. You can say that this or that is evidence, and if you want to buy that, that's fine. But there are always naturalistic explanations for pretty much everything. And the way the tide has gone in the last 400 years as we've discovered science, literally everything that we've been able to test and go through and find out, well, is there some kind of supernatural, magical thing going on here? What we find is a naturalistic explanation for basically everything, from the weather to, well, you name it. It's everything that science has discovered is tied in with a naturalistic explanation. There are still things that we don't know and we don't understand, but at this point, the weight of evidence has completely shifted over to, well, we have to assume that there's some naturalistic explanation, and that's what science does. It assumes the naturalistic presumption, and it moves on from there, because that's all you can do. There's a great cartoon, I don't know if you've ever seen it, where a scientist is writing this great formula on the board, and I have it here, but I know my computer will crash. He's writing on the board, he has this very elaborate equation going, and then it says, then a miracle occurs, and then the equation goes on. If you don't presume naturalism, that's what you get. In the Mr. Deity world, we had an episode where Mr. Deity comes up with his own equations because he liked what that Einstein guy said about E equals MC Hammer. And his equation is basically E equals Mr. Deity did it. But it's written out nicely, and it looks like an actual scientific equation. So what you have is these arguments, probably the most famous of which is William Lane Craig's cosmological argument, the cosmological argument, which goes like this. It's a very simple syllogism. It says, anything that begins to exist, let me make sure I've got it right. Anything that begins to exist, all things that begin to exist have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and he says that cause is God. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We don't quite know. I think there's a problem with that in the fact that the first premise presumes that there can be something that did not begin to exist. We don't know. We simply don't know. It's once again an argument from ignorance, and what you learn from ignorance is nothing. You don't know anything. If you're ignorant, that's all you can go. You can't say, I don't know, therefore this must be true. It's I don't know, therefore that's all I know. That's it. That's the end of it. I have my own syllogism that I came up with. I think you're going to like this. All things that exist have a cause. The God of Abraham does not have a cause. Therefore, the God of Abraham cannot exist. So that's my reasoning back on him. This is basically the battle between religion and science. It's about the arguments and whether the arguments mean anything beyond a simple argument. In science, you have an argument. That's the beginning point. That's not the end point. That's called a hypothesis. And then you take that hypothesis and you find some way to, first of all, you try to falsify it to see if you're just flat out wrong, because it's easier to figure out if you're wrong than it is to figure out if you're right. So you try to falsify it by coming up with some kind of experiment that can falsify the whole thing. Well, if this happens, then this is a silly theory and we'll throw it out from the get-go. There's never a time where we just say, oh, that's a good theory, that makes sense, let's go with that. That's not what you do. This has been the battle in the last 400 years between science and religion. Do we take a theory, do we take a philosophy and run with it, or do we need something more? And thank God, I almost said, thank heaven, thank me, thank Darwin, we use that in our house, that we have stuck to, no, that's not good enough. Let's move on. Let's see what's going on here. Maybe there is some kind of germs or something that's causing the sickness, rather than God punishing us for our sins or something like that. And we've